Hopefully now we're in a better position to understand how the epistemic regress establishes the necessity of the existence of basic beliefs, which BonJour characterizes in terms of their non-inferential nature. And so he tells us that a central thesis of epistemological foundationalism is the claim that certain empirical beliefs possess a degree of epistemic justification or warrant, which doesn't depend inferentially or otherwise on the justification of other empirical beliefs, but is instead somehow immediate or intrinsic. And of course, all other beliefs that derive their justification through inferences from these basic beliefs. And as I noted, when we were talking about how contemporary epistemologists have extrapolated from Descartes' foundationalism to formulate a more contemporary account, that they allow for what we might refer to as counterfactual inference to be sufficient for justification in ways that Descartes definitely would not. So BonJour notes on page 2 that a belief in question need not have been arrived at as the result of an inference in order to be inferentially justified. Well, that's obviously a person for whom a belief is inferentially justified need not have explicitly rehearsed the justificatory argument in question to others or even to him or herself. It is enough that the inference is available to him or her if the belief is called into question. So this idea that we don't actually engage in these processes to generate those beliefs, but that instead it's sufficient that we could, under some specified set of conditions, engage in that process, and that is sufficient, is a widely utilized technique to try and make this kind of view more consistent with how we really see ourselves thinking and reasoning in the real world. So it's difficult to imagine how we got to electrons ourselves through a set of justification transferring inferences from basic experiences that were not capable of being called into question because they were intrinsically justified, right? That seems sort of hard. And so we suppose that, well, it's not necessarily that you have to do that, it's that it has to be possible for you to do that under the following conditions. And this is, in fact, a technique or a move that the logical empiricists, people like Carnap, used when they talked about their explanation of the epistemology of science. So they said, look, scientists don't actually, go through this elaborate reductive process of reducing theoretical entities to relationships among immediate experiences expressed in our object language and so on. No, they don't actually do that. But what gives what they do epistemic heft is that can be done. Indeed, the logical empiricists really developed this distinction and these ideas much more than typically foundationalists do. They distinguish between a context of discovery in which we find the processes that are involved very messy, the evidential relationships are sloppy and unclear, but nevertheless the products have this great epistemic status because in the context of discovery, over in Carnap and Hempel's office, when we actually do all the work to tie things together in these very rigorous ways, we see that that's possible, and that's what gives the epistemic heft to the discoveries that are made in that sloppy and not particularly epistemically praiseworthy way, at least if that were the only thing that happened or the only thing that was possible. Most contemporary foundationalists, however, don't try to elaborate on that very extensively at all. They just want to create this counterfactual relationship between what seems to be true in our ordinary inferential lives and the sorts of inferences that their theory seems to require in order for those beliefs that we form in our ordinary inferential lives to actually be justified. And that distance can be quite significant. For instance, we find BonJour telling us that many beliefs which satisfy the condition or criterion of knowledge depend for their justification on inferences which have not been explicitly formulated, and indeed which could not be explicitly formulated without considerable reflective effort. So once you make that distinction, I'm good not because of what I'm doing, but because of what someone like me or I could do in some rarefied set of circumstances. That's what makes me good from this epistemic perspective. The temptation is to allow that counterfactual distance to be stretched as much as possible in order to save the theory in the face of what we perceive to be regular practice. Of course, Descartes would find this introduction of counterfactual relationships for the purposes of establishing the epistemic merit of particular judgments in his case or beliefs in ours. I even find that utterly repulsive and appalling. For Descartes, there was no counterfactual distance whatsoever. There could be no counterfactual distance between the actual judgment that you make and the epistemic status of that judgment, so that you had to be in the position to clearly and distinctly perceive in a way that left room for zero doubt the relationship between the things that you were judging, and hence this idea that, well, under the right conditions and the right time, you could have made that judgment. And so your judgments, which are sloppy and indistinct, those are fine. He would find that utterly incomprehensible, I think. Nevertheless, the temptation to stretch between actual and counterfactual, where the counterfactual does the epistemic work and the actual benefits from it, is a pretty strong inclination in contemporary epistemology. And it certainly helps epistemologists try and shore up the difference between the sorts of behaviors and experiences that the theories suggest we should have when we're being epistemically praiseworthy, and the sorts of experiences and processes that we actually engage in our everyday inferential and decision-making practices. Having provided us with the basic outline of foundationalism as a class of views about the justification of beliefs, we're now in a position to differentiate two variants that you do find in the contemporary epistemic literature, what BonJour calls strong foundationalism, but which I would call strong but modest foundationalism, noting that there are even stronger versions of it, for instance, Descartes. Strong foundationalism, in this more modest contemporary sense, holds that regresses of epistemic justification terminate in basic beliefs of sufficient intrinsic, that is, non-inferential epistemic warrant to satisfy the justification condition for knowledge. So they are a mechanism by which beliefs can be seen to have sufficient justification in order to count as knowledge. So some strong foundationalists make even stronger claims than this. So they go beyond asserting that these regresses of epistemic justification are going to terminate in basic beliefs, where all it really takes to be a basic belief is to have sufficient intrinsic epistemic warrant to satisfy the justification condition for knowledge. So some foundationalists, Descartes would be a nice example of them, think of basic beliefs as being certain, infallible, incapable of being called into question, unincorrigible. And so I'll suggest that we can differentiate between what BonJour calls strong foundationalism, what I call strong but modest foundationalism, and classical strong foundationalism like that we find in Descartes. Finally, we have what BonJour refers to as weak foundationalism. Now, weak foundationalism has the same basic structure and mechanisms, but it holds that regresses of epistemic justification terminate in basic beliefs, which in and of themselves prove insufficient in their possession of intrinsic or non-inferential epistemic warrant in order to satisfy the justification condition for knowledge in all the beliefs that they transfer their intrinsic justification to. Right? So the requirement for basicness in terms of the intrinsic or novel or original justification that has to be had by these beliefs is lower.